We turn now from the battle over the environment to the threat of war with Iraq. The Los Angeles Times took a poll this week and found that 2/3 of the American people believe President Bush has failed to make the case for going to war. Official Washington got the word. Sources in high places were spreading the story this week that there will be no war at least until January, giving the president more time to marshal his arguments and maybe even produce some hard evidence before giving the order to attack. If you've been watching now on a regular basis, you know we've been covering the debate over Iraq from many sides. Recently, we heard from people who oppose going to war, political activists, clergy, even a Republican member of Congress.
Don't attack Iraq! Don't attack!
We demand to know answers.
Let us hate war in all its forms.
Simply put, the United States wants to have dominance over the oil fields in that region.
There is a question of morality here in terms of first strike action, and we see it in the president's policy statements that he's put forward, that he wants to change the way we think about first strike actions, and the church needs to weigh in on that.
And that's what this is all about, a preemptive strike. I think that is so dangerous, not only to us as a people and to our rule of law and our Constitution, but I believe that will come back to haunt us.
Tonight, we hear from someone who makes the case for war. Christopher Hitchens is a writer, journalist, and intellectual combatant. He writes books faster than most of us can read them. Books on Bill and Hillary Clinton, Henry Kissinger, Mother Teresa, politics, and culture, including this new book, Why Orwell Matters, about his intellectual hero, the British writer George Orwell. You can read Christopher Hitchens regularly in Vanity Fair, but he recently quit his column in The Nation magazine in a dispute with his old comrades on the left, whom he said just don't understand the seriousness of the terrorist threat to America. Christopher Hitchens thinks Saddam Hussein must go, and that only force will get him out. Welcome to Now. I know your position on the war. I've read your arguments, most of them, I think, maybe all of them. What I don't understand is the process that got you here. Was there a moment of eureka, of aha?
Not exactly, but there was a moment, I guess. I'll take a step back, if I may.
Yeah.
I've considered myself for a long time, and when I was on the left, which in many ways I still am, to be a friend of the Kurdish movement in northern Iraq, the Kurdish rebels, and of the Iraqi opposition, the Iraqi Democratic Opposition, known as the INC, Iraqi National Congress. That's a position I've held for many, many years. I held it when American governments, ruling class imperial ones indeed, were in favor of Saddam Hussein. At the end of the last Gulf War, of which I'd been very, very critical, I found myself in a
Same
jeep.
here.
Well, and there was lots to criticize. I don't take much of it back. But at the end of it, I was bouncing around northern Iraq in a jeep with some Kurdish guerrillas who were people I'd come to admire very much for their bravery. On the windshield of this jeep was a picture of George Bush Sr. jogging. And I said to them a couple of times, I said, do you have to have this picture? I would be just as happy not to ride around in a jeep with Bush's picture on it. But they said, no, well, we think we owe him for this. Now, bear in mind, the Gulf War had never had as its intention the establishment of a protected zone for Kurds in the north. That was an unintended consequence of the war. It was the result of public opinion. It was the result of international humanitarian pressure, people saying, you can't end the war in Kuwait with all the Kurds dying on the mountainsides of northern Iraq, being slaughtered by and poisoned by Saddam Hussein. You must do something. And the no-fly zones, which have since guaranteed this, have actually created that space for an embryonic Kurdistan and an embryonic democratic Iraq.
Your intellectual mentor, in a sense, Orwell, he didn't much admire people who weren't there when the trigger is pulled.
That's quite right.
It makes me wonder about journalists and writers, intellectuals like you. We're not going to be there when the trigger is pulled.
I don't feel I need to make this defense for myself, but just for the sake of my own testosterone, I will. I was on the Afghan border last year. I was in Sarajevo during the siege. I was in Kurdistan, and other places too. I know enough about it, by the way. I've seen enough of it to know I wouldn't be any good as a soldier. I wouldn't stand up. I wouldn't stand up very well for long. But the second thing is, where I live in Washington, D.C., I've seen the Pentagon burning from the top of my house. I've seen where my daughter's school is just across the river from that.
After 9/11.
Very difficult to get, tough time getting her back from school that day. The streets were jammed, panic, fire. Since then, anthrax in my mailroom. I'm now just considering whether to have my daughter vaccinated for smallpox. I consider myself to be in the front line, and everyone in the United States to be. That's what's different precisely about this war. So the whole point is that civilians are probably in more danger than people in uniform, and the enemy specifically makes that its strategy.
But the issue to me is that if it goes wrong, the president, his cabinet, they'll lose the election and history will be hard on them. The people in Iraq will suffer and be in chaos or dead if it goes badly. We can advocate war and then move on to our next cause, to our next story. Maybe it's a distinction that doesn't hit home with you, but it makes me more reluctant than when I was in government to think that intellectuals and journalists should be urging people to go to war.
I think the same obligation falls on those who are opposed to intervention to say, well, do they have any reason to think that the threat from an aggressive, neurotic, sadistic totalitarian dictatorship will not eventuate? What will it be like if Mr. Hussein gets hold of deterrent quality weapons of genocide? I think I have a very good idea of what life would be like. What he would be able to do, for example, if he wanted to get attention, would be, say, to reoccupy Kuwait or perhaps a part of Saudi Arabia and say, if you try and push me out, I can irradiate these oil fields. I can poison them for generations. I mean, he would put the world economy into a slump and kill millions of people in doing so. We know, not just from defectors from Iraq, of whom there have been many, some of them known to me, but from people still within his administration who've been interviewed, that he has said to his cabinet, that his big mistake was to invade Kuwait before he got a nuclear weapon. We know that he was very near to a weapon before then.
We've seen that in the 12,000 pages.
Why does he say that it would have been better to have a nuclear weapon before I invaded Kuwait? For obvious reasons. Because it would mean he could deter. He could talk to us as the North Koreans now can. I've been there too. Saying that they can threaten such terrifying destruction that they have to be talked to in a conciliatory tone of voice. And a lot of the anti-war calculus is based on the idea that he understands deterrence. He understands self-preservation. He can be deterred and contained. I don't believe it. I think his regime has become demented.
Has there been any experience in your lifetime, except for the defeat of Germany and Japan, where after a war like this, we have been able, or our democratic experience has emerged from that new reality?
Well, I think Afghanistan at the moment is a very good case in point.
But very tentative.
Yes, but the case for the invasion, I don't even think it was an invasion, the case for the intervention in Afghanistan wasn't any better to begin with than a self-defense one. By removing a theocratic dictatorship of the most cruel and retrograde kind, for one thing, the population of Afghanistan has gone up by 1.5 million because refugees have been allowed to come home, and the life of everybody is better, especially for the female 50%.
This is not going to be a war against a standing army out in the desert.
No, but it is a war over Iraq. Whether it's on Iraq or with Iraq or not, we can dispute, but it's about Iraq. It's a war for Iraq, in my view, but certainly over Iraq. It means the whole country has to be extensively reconstructed, and we have to prevent things like revenge killings, of which there will otherwise be a huge number when this regime goes because of the unbelievable sadism of its policy.
How much collateral damage would you accept for removing Saddam Hussein?
It's not knowable in advance. It would sound terrible to say, well, once you've started, you accept the logical and probable consequences. That might seem callous, but you do. How many people have asked me how many American soldiers I think, or British soldiers ought, how many would be too many? It seems to me that's an irresponsible question, forgive me, but one can be pretty sure that a very large number of people will die for sure, for certain, if this regime goes on, and not only Iraqis. And I think that gives one a license to say, well, the point of precision weaponry and precision guidance is precisely that. The Defense Department, as I have other reasons to know, has actually listened to the anti-war movement down the years. It did listen to that critique. They may say collateral damage now, it's an ugly euphemism, but they used to just say body count and lay them out, right? This is something, they wouldn't dare do that now. Furthermore, they don't have to.
Well, this was a significant factor, as you know, in the growing opposition to the Vietnam War. As the body count kept coming back, the reality kept hitting home, and no amount of euphemistic language in defense of South Vietnam would suffice to answer the growing piles of body bag.
Quite. Well, this won't be the case this time.
We have sort of prided ourselves, we Americans, on never going to war, never starting a war, never striking first. Does something happen in the moral psychology, the gross national psychology of a people once we have adopted preemptive strikes as national policy?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, it worries me very much. As does, for example, the doctrine that's been promoted lately, saying that the United States must always maintain a certain it's something like 10 or 20% margin of superiority over any combination of rivals.
That's the new national security
Then they go
strategy.
to the British government, say, or the French or the Germans, say, by the way, we'd like your help in fighting. They say, what, you want us to help fight to keep your superiority. That's not a very, it's not a very polite way of soliciting sympathy or allies, for example. I mean, I think it was grotesque to talk like that. There's a certain kind of arrogance and hubris about this administration that fills me with horror. The reappointment of people like Elliot Abrams, John Poindexter, people of this kind, people who've shown their contempt for Congress and for the democratic process, and shown their contempt for other people's constitutions and democratic processes as well, and have in unpunished ways visited, you know, aggression and atrocity on other peoples. I mean, it's scandalous that the president...
You're intellectually making alliance with many of those people you have written about and deplored in the past.
The alliance is not intellectual. I mean, I'm glad that so many conservatives now agree with me about regime change, just as I was very glad when many of them changed sides on Bosnia. I wouldn't turn them away, not on this point. But, you know, it's something to keep one's eye on, and I wish the Democratic Party in Washington was making more noise about it. I mean, these are people who've lied to the press, lied to the people, lied to Congress. There are a lot of the right wing are still very strongly opposed to regime change in Iraq.
Yeah, Pat Buchanan.
Well, there's the Scowcroft-Eagleberger sort of conservative pro-Saudi faction. There's the Pat Buchanan group, the sort of America First isolationists, anti-Israeli as well. There's a good deal of conservative opposition to this. In fact, most of the actual opposition in Washington to the war is from the right. Nobody cares what the left or the peaceniks think. Their arguments aren't considered to be worth listening to. They say things like, no war for oil. Well, is that to say oil isn't worth fighting about, or it doesn't matter what Saddam Hussein does to the oil reserves of the region? I mean, how irresponsible could you possibly get?
Do you think the Bush administration has a hidden agenda? Oil?
No, I think that's an open agenda. The recuperation of the Iraqi oil industry could be a bonanza for everybody. I don't think the administration is not saying anything that it ought to say, except one thing, which is that with a large part of its mind, the administration wants to recuperate Iraq and change the regime there in order to break the monopoly the Saudis now have. Saddam Hussein is the Saudis' buffer state. That's why the Saudis are so much opposed to the war. We now know so much about how Saudi Arabia is not our friend, but is a particularly deadly, mean and vicious enemy. But this can't be said for reasons of realpolitik. But it's known, and it certainly forms part of the strategy. It's one of my reasons for supporting it, is that that's the end of the Saudi monopoly.
With all due respect, that's a very tenuous point. We don't know what the Saudis are going to do.
To have anything like a pluralist state in Iraq next door, with the Shia, who form very near the majority in Saudi Arabia, having a say in politics, and the oil,
if you can get that pluralistic.
Well, it has to be better than it is now. That's not boasting to say it'll be an improvement on what we now have. And then to get the Iraqi oil moving again, and its oil industry back in business, every bit of that tells against the current Saudi advantage. Every bit of it does.
I've noticed a good bit of opposition coming from traditional religious circles, mainstream Protestants, the Catholics, a lot of the religious people who've taken liberal positions in our society over the years are more consistently opposing the administration than your old allies on the left, your old friends on the left.
Yes. Well, to be blunt, I don't care what religious people think. I mean, it doesn't impress me. I think they should declare that the kingdom of God is not of this world, and they should get on doing the best they can. They've also got a lot of repair work to do in their own churches, as far as I can see. I don't take seriously the statements of people whose role in life is to proclaim themselves to be ministers of religion. It just leaves me cold. I'm sorry. I find religion alternately tedious and disgusting.
I disagree with many of your positions, but I listen to you despite the fact that I know you are an atheist,
yes.
That you do not have any tolerance for religion. I still listen to the arguments you make. Can't you grant that to people who claim a religious basis?
Yes, I get the same thing, but a placard saying no war for oil is no cleverer being held up by a rabbi.
But I haven't seen rabbis holding that up. Rabbis,
some do.
And priests talk about just war. You know,
I went to Harvard. I went to the Kennedy School last week to debate with Father Brian Hare, who was
he was on this show.
He was the head of Georgetown University. He's a very considerable, apparently, Catholic theologian, and it's tough to be a Catholic clergyman in Boston these days, so I cut him a little slack. Apparently, he also advises the Pentagon, I've been told, on ethical matters. He put up a perfectly good case about what St. Augustine or St. Thomas Aquinas might have thought about this, but I found it very hard to listen to, Frank. I can't conceal my... I won't pretend to respect him more than I do. I thought in the age of weapons of mass destruction and rapid delivery systems and globalization and so on, this stuff is of no help to us, any more than the Sermon on the Mount would be. I'm very impressed, by the way, that this debate has been going on for several months now in public. Almost all the stakes are known, almost all the evidence is out there. The administration and the British government have both published exhaustive arsenals, really, of information as well as argument. Everyone's had a chance to make up their mind. The United Nations has pronounced on the disarmament, at any rate, of the Saddam Hussein regime. I wish myself that a great deal more was said, and I consider my role in this argument, if I have one of my own, to be this, to say more about the incredible courage and success of the Kurdish and Iraqi opposition, and to give them all the help that we can, and to publish their manifestos and their experiences to the Arab world and beyond, and to make it harder and harder to back off any commitment that the United States makes to them, to make sure that it is in that spirit that the intervention justifies itself, and that this is a standard to which the administration can and must be held.
Thank you very much,
Thank you, Bill,
Hitchens.
very much. Thanks for having me.
Republican member of Congress.
Don't attack Iraq! Don't attack!
We demand to know answers.
Let us hate war in all its forms.
Simply put, the United States wants to have dominance over the oil fields in that region.
There is a question of morality here in terms of...
Or at least until January, giving the president more time to marshal his arguments and maybe even produce some hard evidence before giving the order to attack. If you've been watching now on a regular basis, you know we've been covering the debate over Iraq from many sides. Recently, we heard from people who oppose going to war, political activists, clergy, even a Republican. We turn now from the battle over the environment to the threat of war with Iraq. The Los Angeles Times took a poll this week and found that 2/3 of the American people believe President Bush has failed to make the case for going to war. Official Washington got the word. Sources in high places were spreading the story this week that there will be no war.
First strike action, and we see it in the president's policy statements that he's put forward, that he wants to change the way we think about first strike actions, and the church needs to weigh in on that.
And that's what this is all about, a preemptive strike. I think that is so dangerous, not only to us as a people and to our rule of law and our Constitution, but I believe that will come back to haunt us.
Tonight, we hear from someone who makes the case for war. Christopher Hitchens is a writer, journalist, and intellectual combatant. He writes books faster than most of us can read them. Books on Bill and Hillary Clinton, Henry Kissinger, Mother